Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to East Central Missouri and the world, and welcome to the James Strong Show podcast number 279. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for making us a part of your day. I appreciate it. This podcast was recorded on the morning of Saturday, August the 6th, from the James Strong Studio in western St. Charles County. The topic of today's podcast, the John Fogerty you never knew. John Fogerty, lead man, brains behind one of the most popular rock groups of all times, Creedence Clearwater Revival. There's a troubling past to that group, and really they were on top and number one, except for maybe the Beatles, between 1968 and 1972. And after 1970, of course, when the Beatles folded, Creedence Clearwater Revival was probably the number one rock group of the time. And John Fogerty was the brains behind that. And that was both a blessing and a curse for the group. We're going to go into Creedence Clearwater Revival and, more importantly, John Fogerty and all the hoops he had to jump through, all the problems that he had with the group, most of which I would say were self-inflicted wounds. Anyway, we'll get into that. But first, a few notes. Last week, was it last week? Week before last, I did a podcast, and I kind of advertised it as, hey, we're going to talk about certain wines. And I did. About 50 minutes into the podcast, and the biggest feedback I got back from that podcast was, hey, I thought you were going to talk about this wine. What the heck? You finally did, but come on. Okay. I'm going to mention a wine that I had, and I'm on this kick. I've mentioned it before. Reasonably priced, exceptional value, very good tasting wines, and you can get them. I mean, a lot of people saying, okay, here's Strong, Mr. Moneybags. He's going to talk about his $70 bottle of wines that others can't afford and nobody wants. No, that's not it at all. $70 bottle of wines are wonderful. But as I mentioned in previous podcasts, when you get a bottle of wine that's maybe $10, $15, $20 a bottle, quite often the difference between that and a $70 bottle of wine isn't a whole lot. And I'm finding this out more and more, particularly wines that come from Europe. Reason being is the parity of the dollar to the euro. Not too long ago, the euro to the dollar was about 1.3 to 1, 1.2 to 1. Now it's about 1 to 1. In other words, it costs 20 to 30% less than it used to. Oh, and by the way, the tariffs that were put on some European wines are gone. So the tariffs are off. The dollar to the euro is very favorable for us. So European wines are very reasonably priced. And I tried one last night. I had it with, I had smoked salmon. I smoked salmon on the grill. And I had a Loendet Pinot Noir from France. Bought it at Trader Joe's. It was $7. Okay. And it's very, very good. Now, Pinot Noir is a wine that a lot of people like. It's a red wine that you can drink with milder meats. In other words, you can drink Pinot Noir with fish, just so the fish is kind of a stronger fish like salmon, and I did smoke it with spices. So you can certainly drink a Pinot Noir with salmon. I enjoy red wine. This is a red wine that paired well with the salmon. I posted a picture of the wine on my Facebook page. So take a look at it if you like. Another example of a really, really, really good wine for not a bunch of money, okay? And as I've mentioned before, if you get a good wine, you don't have to pay a lot for it. But one of the things that you need to understand is if you're going to drink a wine to get the most value out of it, I would say, the most enjoyment out of it, drink it in the proper glass, would you? Spend some money on some good stemware. This wine was drunk from my Riedel glasses that you can get Riedel glasses at Target, okay? They're crystal, but they're machine blown, so they're not so terribly expensive. And a Pinot Noir glass has a different geometry to it than, say, a Cabernet glass or a Zin glass or a white wine glass. It's bigger at the bottom, narrower at the top. But if you drink a moderately priced wine in an exceptional glass that you just have to buy once, by the way, you get a whole lot more benefit out of it. So check it out, that Pinot Noir that you can pick up at Costco. There's many other values out there as well. Things that have gone by the wayside, things that are no longer relevant, things that used to be a big deal once upon a time and are no longer a big deal anymore. And two of which are individuals. Now, these individuals have both since passed away. You may or may not have heard of them. I'm going to mention these two names, and you may have heard of some of them. One of them you may not. Joel Bushbaum and Dave Strauss. Do those names sound familiar to you? Well, let me tell you who they were. Okay, Joel Bushbaum was a guy with a photographic memory. I guess they just said he was a special individual back then. Now we would say he was on the spectrum, so to speak. He lived in an institution where he had to be cared for, but the guy knew everything about college football players and pro football players that you needed to know. In other words, someone would say, hey, Joel, the Miami Dolphins are thinking about drafting Bill Smith in the 5th round of the upcoming draft. Tell me about Bill Smith. Joel Bushbaum will say, yeah, Bill Smith, he was a lineman for the University of North Carolina, but he went to high school at XYZ High School, where he started at left tackle, and he was also the quarterback, plus the shortstop on the baseball team, and he's this and this and that. He runs a 4.5 40, and he does this. Joel Bushbaum knew everything about every football player out there. Then there was Dave Strauss, Mr. Trivia, they called him. And he had a Sunday night show on KMOX where people would call in and ask him a question. Hey, remember that guy who used to be on Bewitched and he was in half the episodes? He was, oh yeah, that's so-and-so. He was this and this and that. And he was, Dave Strauss knew trivia like nobody else. And occasionally someone would stump him, but he'd get back with them the next week on what he called the homework. He'd always call it homework. Dave Strauss was a school teacher in his day job. Well, talents of people like Joel Bushbaum and Dave Strauss, while they were just incredible talents, there is nobody like that anymore. And you think, well, why isn't there? It's simple. Because while Joel Bushbaum and Dave Strauss knew almost everything about their said trivia professions, we have the internet now. So there's no need to ask those questions of those individuals. But if you remember Joel Bushbaum, if you remember Dave Strauss, those guys were incredible. They were the human computers of their days before there was a Google. Before we get into the John Fogerty You Never Knew, I stumbled upon a very interesting article in the Wall Street Journal this week, written by Callum Bochers, who's a good columnist for the Wall Street Journal. And it has to do with certain jobs, certain professions. And you hear all the time, well, you know, it's hard to get a good job. Jobs are out there, but good jobs are hard to find, which is true, by the way. But good jobs are certainly out there. And many times when you have a situation where certain jobs are no longer needed like they were needed, in other words, let's say to fill position X, there used to be 100,000 people out there. Well, or 100,000 positions out there. Well, through automation and the way things change, there's no longer a need for 100,000 of these people out there, but there's a need for 10,000, okay? Only 10% of what there used to be. The problem is when you have something like that and you still have a need, but not the need that you used to have, your talent pool just goes away. And The article talks about personal assistants, okay? Now, you used to have personal assistants because they took messages, they typed up memos, they did all the stuff that nobody does anymore. They answer your phone. Okay, nobody does that anymore because we have cell phones. Everything's automated, okay? But in the penthouse society, there is a crisis for these people. There's no one around now to charter the jet. There's too few aides with the versatility to navigate earnings reports along with the wine list. And for goodness gracious sakes, who's going to scoop up the Papillon's poop? That's right. The labor shortage has affected personal assistants for the uber rich. Now, you keep hearing now these rich people. Okay, there's more and more of these rich people all the time. And they don't want to scoop up their doggy's poop. They want somebody to manage the wine list for them. Now, you, dear listeners, have me, your gracious host, to manage your wine list, but that's another story for another day. The uber rich don't do that. And the labor shortage affects many businesses. It's disrupting the affairs of the uber rich. And the uber rich's lament has always been, good help is hard to find. Now, this has seldom been so true for executive assistants, okay? Now, executive assistants for the uber rich, it's a job that demands a rare combination of competence and humility. Now, one agency discussed placing someone who holds a PhD in a role that involves high-level administrating work and fetching coffee, okay? The going rate for such overqualified aides, what do you think that job pays? How about $200,000 a year in New York City and LA and big markets like that? Now, St. Louis, probably only half that. But think about it. $100,000 a year for a Girl Friday with some other qualifications. Okay. Now, those with the busiest lives, those with the uber rich, if they really want somebody who really does kiss their tail, $300,000, $400,000 a year is what these personal assistants get paid. Now, Teresa Lee, who's a scout for top-tier assistants for the uber wealthy, says the rich are willing to pay those salaries, but it's really all about them. Okay, you can get the money, but man, you got to do whatever they say. Now, with great pay comes great sacrifice. In fact, some of these people who take these jobs for all this money, they quit within 72 hours. Ms. Lee says that's owing to the unpredictable schedules, the endless to-do lists, the rigorous travel, the sense of loneliness that can set in when someone is close to, but distinctly separate from, an elite class of people. In other words, you've got to be their right-hand man or woman, but you're certainly not their equal, and you have to understand that. Now, Ms. Lee says she tries to get employers to agree to the limits on what people what people can do in places they need to be. In other words, serving martinis like a butler or cleaning up dog poop off the roof deck, those are real requests from clients. And sometimes people aren't going to do it, especially the Gen Xers. Now, several factors combine to create a frantic market in which do-all assistants are extremely pricey and ripe for poaching from other clients. Certain secretarial tasks once performed by executive assistants, like answering phones, shuffling papers, they're automated, they're digitized. You don't need to do that anymore. And there's been a steep drop in numbers of those positions. But those that remain are extremely advanced, okay? The rich want right-hand helpers who can dart from professional to personal manners with ease and with the utmost discretion. And non-disclosure agreements are standard in this industry. Finding millennials and Gen Xers to replace the aging assistants, that's proving a challenge. Here's the case of Tiffany Maughan, who's a 51-year-old executive assistant and chief executive officer to a consulting group. She says, I've heard young people say to me, I would never do what you do. It's almost like they don't understand working for a service in a service capacity for another human being. Ms. Maughan goes on, as long as it's legal, as long as it's safe, there really is a no. In other words, you do whatever these people say. Ms. Maughan has aided executives and wealthy families for more than 2 decades and says she takes pride in making bosses she admires happier and more efficient. As she describes a career path that is alternatively exhilarating and humbling. Now, there's yachts and parties sometimes where she feels like a confidant and a senior advisor. She's also been scolding for spelling errors, been called on the phone at 3 a.m, and she's been on her hands and knees to fix a leaky faucet in a vacation home. You really do have to do it all. She recalls one episode in which a former employer chastised her and 2 other assistants. So this person had 3 people working for him. And each of them made over $150,000 a year for putting bananas in the refrigerator instead of on the kitchen counter. Now, Ms. Maughan says that she hopes to retire with her current boss, although she's often invited to interview for positions that would pay $200,000 plus a bonus. She makes $150,000 now. That's for becoming a chief of staff, which she describes as the holy grail of executive assistants. So there you have it. If you're willing to do whatever it takes to make someone happy, just so it's safe and legal, you can make really good dough. $150,000, $200,000, $300,000, $400,000, that's good money. Now, for those of you that say, I would never stoop that low, I would never clean up dog poop, I would never fetch martinis or coffee for some rich a-hole, I would never fill in the blank. Remember the mantra of the strong man. I've said this for years. If you're not going to run the show, if you're going to work for somebody else, and let's face it, most of us work for somebody else. But if you're going to do that, there's a 2-step process that the strong man says always take. Number 1, if you're going to work for somebody, eat their crap. Number 2, take their money. Do you not like to be scolded for putting bananas in the refrigerator? Okay. But if the job pays $150,000 a year, can you look past it? I think you probably can. Okay. The John Fogerty that you never knew. Creedence Clearwater Revival, you know about them. They were a classic American rock band formed in El Centro, California. That's right, not down on the bayou, not on the Mississippi River, El Cerrito, California. And the band initially consisted of the lead vocalist, the lead guitarist, the primary songwriter John Fogerty and his brother, that's John and Tom Fogerty, bassist Stu Cook, and drummer Doug Clifford. Those 4. Those members had played together since 1959. They were high school buddies. Actually, John Fogerty, Stu Cook, and Doug Clifford were high school buddies. Tom Fogerty, who was John's older brother, was a bit older than John and Stu and Doug. Okay, but these members played together since 1959 when they were called the Blue Velvets. Later on, they were called the Gollywogs. And then they settled on the name Creedence Clearwater Revival in 1967. I mean, CCR's musical style encompassed rock's roots, swamp rock, blue rock, southern rock, country rock, blue-eyed soul. They were from the San Francisco Bay Area, that's El Cerrito, and the band often played in a southern rock style with lyrics about bayou and catfish and the Mississippi River and other elements of the southern U.S. The band's songs rarely dealt with romantic love, concentrating instead on political and social consciousness lyrics about topics like the Vietnam War. The band performed at Woodstock. In fact, they were the first major act signed to Woodstock when it first started to become a reality. CCR disbanded in 1972 after 4 years of chart-topping success. Now, Tom Fogerty, the older brother of John, had officially left the previous year, and John was at odds with the remaining members over matters of business and artistic control, all of which resulted in subsequent lawsuits among the former band members. John Fogerty refused to perform with the other 2 surviving members at the Creedence Clearwater Revival's 1993 induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Although the band has never officially reunited, John Fogerty continues to perform CCR songs as part of his solo act, while Cook and Clifford have performed as Creedence Clearwater Revised since the 90s. Now, CCR's music is still a staple of U.S. classic rock radio airplay. 28 million CCR records have been sold in the U.S. alone. The compilation album Chronicles, the 20 greatest hits of CCR, it was originally released in 1976, and it's still on the Billboard Top 200 album chart list. 500 weeks in a row on the top 200 as of December 2020. It's 10 times platinum. It's still selling, folks. Now, John Fogerty, Doug Clifford, and Stu Cook, they met at Portola High School in El Cerrito, California. They called themselves the Blue Velvet, and they basically played instrumentals and jukebox standards. John's older brother, Tom, he actually was the vocalist at the time. So Tom did the singing. John, Clifford, and Stu Cook, they did the backing music. Now, John Fogerty eventually took over control of the group by singing lead vocals and blossoming into a multi-instrumentalist who played keyboards, harmonica, saxophone, in addition to lead guitar. By 1967, he was also producing the group's recordings. Now, in 1967, Saul Zaentz, he bought Fantasy Records, and he offered the band a chance to record a full-length album. Now, he didn't like the name Gollywogs. The band decided to change their name to Creedence Clearwater Revival. Now, according to interviews with band members 20 years later, the name's elements came from three sources: Tom Fogerty's friend, Creedence Newball, a television commercial for Olympia Beer where they talked about clear water, and then just their renewed commitment to their band, Revival. Okay. Now, in fact, Cook described the name as weirder than Buffalo Springfield or Jefferson Airplane. And he's kind of right. Now, by 1968, AM radio programmers around the U.S. took note when CCR's cover of the 1956 rockabilly song Susie Q received substantial airplay in the Bay Area and on Chicago's WLS, now a talk station, but at that time, big-time rock and roll station. It was the band's second single and their first one to reach top 40. Susie Q reached number 11. And it was the only top 40 hit not written by John Fogerty. Now, two other singles were released in their May 1968 debut album, Screamin' Jay Hawkins and his I Put a Spell on You, and Porterville. Okay. Now, after breaking through, CCR began touring and started working on their second album, Bayou Country, released in January 1969 at RCA Studios in L.A. The number 7 platinum hit, the record was their first string of hits off of an album to produce singles that really never did stop. The single Proud Mary and Born on the Bayou reached number 2 on the national Billboard charts. The former, Proud Mary, would eventually become the group's most coveted songs, with some 100 versions by other artists to date, including the number 4 71 hit by Ike and Tina Turner 2 weeks after the original one, 2 years after the original from CCR peaked. John cites this song as being the result of high spirits on gaining his discharge from the Army Reserve. The album also featured a remake of the rock and roll classic Good Golly, Miss Molly. Months later, April 1969, Bad Moon Rising, backed with Lodi, was released and peaked number 2 also in the U.S. In the UK, Bad Moon Rising spent 3 weeks at number 1 on the UK single chart during September and October of 1969. It became the band's only number 1 single in the UK. They never had one in the U.S., believe it or not. Now, the band's third album, Green River, followed in August of 1969, was the first album to reach the Billboard 200 and went gold along with the single Green River, which again reached number 2 on the Billboard charts. CCR continued to tour constantly, with performances in July 69 at the Atlanta Pop Festival and August 69 at Woodstock. Their set was not included in the Woodstock film or on the soundtrack because John Fogerty felt the band's performance was subpar, so he wouldn't let the video onto the movie. Four tracks from the event, out of a total of 11, were eventually included in the 1994 commemorative box set, Woodstock 3 Days of Peace and Music. Cook, however, held an opposing view, saying the performances are classic CCR, and I'm still amazed by the number of people who don't even know we were one of the headliners at Woodstock in '69. John later complained the act that preceded them, the Grateful Dead, had put the audience to sleep. As John scanned the audience, he saw a Dante scene, just bodies from hell, all intertwined and asleep, covered with mud. Now, CCR, which disbanded in '72, were progressive. They were a progressive band, of course, and they were an unapologetic throwback to the golden era of rock and roll. They broke ranks with their peers on the progressive, psychedelic San Francisco scene. Their approach was basic and uncompromising, holding true to the band members' working-class origins. The term roots rock hadn't really been invented yet, but CCR kind of did invent them. In essence, they defined it, drawing inspiration from the likes of Little Richard, Hank Williams, Elvis Presley, Chuck Berry. And in doing so, CCR became the standard bearers and foremost celebrants of homegrown American music. Now, after Woodstock, CCR were busy honing material for a fourth album, Willie and the Poor Boys, their second top 3 LP. They released that in November of '69. Down on the Corner, Fortunate Son, they climbed to number 3 and number 14, respectively, by the year's end. Now, the album was CCR's standard mode, featuring Fogerty originals and 2 reworked Leadbelly covers, Cotton Fields and Midnight Special. In November 1969, CCR performed Fortunate Son and Down on the Corner on The Ed Sullivan Show. And back then, being on The Ed Sullivan Show, that means you really made it. CCR released another double A-side hit, Travelin' Band and Who'll Stop the Rain. That was in January of 1970. The speedy Travelin' Band, with a strong Little Richard sound, however, bore enough similarities to Good Golly Miss Molly to warrant a lawsuit by the song's publisher. Now, it was eventually settled out of court. The song ultimately topped out at number 2 again. In February, CCR were featured on the cover of Rolling Stone, although only John Fogerty was interviewed in the accompanying article. And that was part of the problem and part of the solution, but we'll get into that later. In April of '70, CCR were set to begin their first European tour. Now, to support the upcoming live dates, John wrote Up Around the Bend and Run Through the Jungle. The single reached number 4 that spring, and the band returned to Wally Heider Studios in San Francisco. That was in June to record Cosmo's Factory. Now, that album contained earlier top 10 hits, Traveling Band and Up Around the Bend. Remember, those songs were written but not released on an album. Cosmo Factory was released in July of 1970 and was the number 1 in the U.S. for 9 weeks. It was released along with the band's 5th and final number 2 hit, Looking Out My Back Door. Although they topped some international charts and local radio countdowns, CCR has never had the distinction of having 5. They had 5 number 2 singles and 0 number 1 singles on the Hot 100. That's the most by any group. Now, their 5 number 2 singles were exceeded only by Madonna, Taylor Swift, and Drake, with 6 each, and tied with Elvis Presley and the Carpenters. But they never had a number 1 hit. Other cuts on the Cosmo Factory album included an 11-minute jam of Marvin Gaye's Heard It Through the Grapevine, number 1 hit when an edited version was released as a single in '76, and a nearly note-for-note homage to Roy Orbison's Ooby Dooby. The album was their biggest seller and went to number 1 on the Billboard 200 charts and number 11 on Billboard's Soul album charts. So it charted on both charts. Pendulum, released in 1970, December, was another top seller, spawning the top 10 hit, Have You Ever Seen the Rain? John included a Hammond B3 organ on many of Pendulum's tracks, notably, Have You Ever Seen the Rain? Now, you remember the organ on that. That was a little bit different for CCR. Now, around that time, an overwhelming perception among other band members was that John was being overly controlling and domineering within the group, and the tension was approaching a boiling point. And this is where things started to get bad. In the spring of 1971, John Fogerty, frustrated with the remaining bandmates because Tom had already quit the group, Cook and Clifford. In the spring of 1971, John Fogerty, frustrated with the remaining bandmates' constant complaining that they were not allowed to write and produce their own songs. In fact, Cook and Clifford said the CCR would only continue by adopting a democratic approach. Each member now would write and perform his own material, and each band member contributed 3 songs apiece to the next album. Fogerty would only contribute guitar parts to his bandmates' songs. Now, for his part, Fogerty recounts that Cook and Clifford were initially excited about the new opportunity to write and perform their own songs, because that's what they had been asking for all along. And their own songs were free of his meddling, as they had been the ones who had asked for it to begin with, that only the concept soured after the record's lack of success. So they got what they wanted, and the album was not successful. Now, allegedly, Fogerty at one point insisted that they accept the arrangements or he would quit the band. The trio put its new work ethic to the test at the studio, releasing the top 10 hit Sweet Hitchhiker in June 1971, back with Cook's Door to Door. The band toured both the U.S. and Europe that summer and autumn, with Cook's song a part of the live set. In spite of their continuing commercial success, however, relations among the three had been increasingly strained. Now, the band's final album, Mardi Gras, was released in April 1972, featuring the songs written by John Fogerty, Cook, and Clifford, as well as a cover of Hello, Mary Lou, a Gene Pitney song. Okay, originally Gene Pitney wrote that for Ricky Nelson. Now, each band member sang lead vocal on their own songs that were written by them. Now, the album was a critical failure, considered by the critics to be an inconsistent quality and lacking in cohesion. Rolling Stone reviewer John Landau deemed it the worst album I have ever heard from a major rock band. The sales of Mardi Gras were weaker than previous albums, ultimately peaking at number 12, although it still became the band's 7th consecutive studio album to be certified as gold. Now, despite the relatively poor reception of Mardi Gras and the deteriorated relationships between the remaining band members, CCR embarked upon a 2-month, 20-date U.S. tour. However, in October of 1972, less than 6 months after the tour ended, Fantasy Records and the band officially announced its disbanding. CCR never formally reunited after the breakup, although Cook and Clifford eventually started the band Creedence Clearwater Revisited. John Fogerty later commented on the demise of CCR in a 1997 edition of the Swedish magazine Pop. Here's what Fogerty said. I was alone, and this is the telling thing about John Fogerty. Okay, good or bad or indifferent, this is the telling thing about John Fogerty. I was alone when I made CCR's music. I was alone when I made the arrangements. I was alone when I added background vocals, guitars, and some other stuff. I was alone when I produced and mixed the albums. The other guys showed up only for rehearsals and in the days that we made the actual recordings. For me, Creedence was like sitting on a time bomb. We had decent success with our cover of Susie Q and with the first album when we went into the studio to cut Proud Mary. It was the first time we were in a real Hollywood studio, RCA's LA studio, and the problem started immediately. The other guys in the band insisted on writing songs for the new album. They had opinions on the arrangements, and they wanted to sing. They went as far as by adding vocals to Proud Mary, and it sounded awful. They used tambourines, and it sounded no better. That's when I understood I had to make a choice. At that point in time, we were just a one-hit wonder, and Susie Q really hadn't been that big of a hit. Either this would be a success, something really big, or we might as well start working at the car wash again. There was a big row. We went to an Italian restaurant, and I remember that I clearly told the other members that I, for one, didn't want to go back to work at the car wash again. Now we had to make the best possible album, and it wasn't important who did what, as long as the result was the best, very best that we could achieve. And of course, I was the one who should do it. I don't think the others really understood what I meant, but at least I could manage the situation the way I wanted. The result was 8 million-selling double-sided singles in a row and 6 albums, all that went platinum. And Melody Maker had us as one of the best bands in the world. That was after the Beatles split, but still one of the best bands in the world. And I was the one who had created all of this. Despite that, I don't think they understood what I was talking about. They were obsessed with the idea of more control and more influence. So finally, the bomb exploded, and we never worked together again. Now that's quite a statement by John Fogerty. Maybe there's that fine line, as I used to say, that fine line between confidence and arrogance. That's what this was. That statement by John Fogerty is very arrogant. But there's one caveat. It's also very true. John Fogerty was CCR. Now in 1973, Fogerty began his solo career with the Blue Ridge the Blue Ridge Rangers, and his one-man band collection of country and gospel songs. Now, under his old CCR contract, however, Fogerty owed Fantasy Records 8 more albums, and in the end, he just refused to work for the label. The impasse was resolved only after David Geffen's Asylum Records bought Fogerty's contract for $1 million. In 1975, he released his only album, self-entitled John Fogerty. His next major hit was Center Field, a chart-topping success in 1985. On tour in 1986, however, Fogerty suffered complaints over his steadfast refusal to perform CCR songs and suffered with recurring vocal problems, which he blamed on because he had to testify and talk so much in court. Fogerty's explanation for not playing CCR material was that he would have to pay performance royalties to copyright holder Zantz, and that was too painful to revisit the musical past. Now, with the Centerfold album, Fogerty also found himself entangled in a new tit-for-tat lawsuit with Fantasy Records over the song Old Man Down the Road, to which was, according to Fantasy Records Zantz, a blatant rewrite of Fogerty's own 1970 hit Run Through the Jungle. Here's the irony. Since Fogerty had traded his rights of CCR songs in 1980 to cancel his remaining contractual obligations, Fantasy now owned the rights to Run Through the Jungle and sued Fogerty essentially for plagiarizing himself because he didn't own the rights anymore. Now, while a jury ruled that in Fogerty's favor, he did settle a defamation lawsuit by Fantasy's Saul Zantz over the song Mr. Greed and Zantz Can't Dance. Fogerty was forced to edit the recording to change Zantz to Vance. Again, because Fantasy Records owner was Saul Zantz. In February 1987, at the Palomino Club in North Hollywood, Fogerty broke his own self-imposed ban on performing CCR hits. Bob Dylan, George Harrison, Taj Mahal, and Jesse Ed Davis all joined him on stage, and they said, look, if you don't do this and start singing CCR hits, the whole world's going to think Proud Mary is a Tina Turner song. In 1987, Independence Day benefit concert for Vietnam veterans, Fogerty finally ran through the list of CCR hits, beginning with Born on the Bayou and ending with Proud Mary. In 1986, he also released his second Warner Brothers album, Eye of the Zombie. Fogerty retreated from music again in the late 1980s, but returned in 1997 with the Grammy-winning Blue Moon Swamp. Fogerty still tours frequently and now performs CCR classics alongside his solo material. The Trophy Wife and I saw him at the Fox Theater, and he was wonderful, had not missed a beat. Now Tom Fogerty released several solo albums, although none of them reached the success of CCR. His 1974 album, Zephyr National, was the last to feature the 4 original CCR band members. Now, several tracks sounded very much like CCR style, particularly aptly titled Joyful Resurrection, on which all 4 members played, although Fogerty recorded his part separately, so they never really played together. Tom Fogerty died at his home in Scottsdale, Arizona in September 1990 of AIDS complication, which he contracted via a tainted blood transfusion when he had back surgery. Tom and John barely reconciled before Tom's death. And in the eulogy that John delivered at Tom's funeral, John said, "We wanted to grow up and be musicians. I guess we achieved half of that, becoming rock and roll stars. But we didn't necessarily grow up." Junior high school friends Doug Clifford and Stu Cook continued to work together following the demise of CCR as session players and band members of the Don Harrison Band and other various groups mainly as session musicians. So they worked, but they never even approached the success of CCR. Now, following a relatively long period of musical inactivity, Cook and Clifford formed Creedence Clearwater Revisited in 1995 with several well-known musicians. Revisited continues to tour globally and performing the original band classics. John's 1997 injunction forced Creedence Clearwater Revisited to temporarily change their name to Cosmo's Factory, but the courts later ruled in Cook and Clifford's favor. Now, after CCR, Fantasy Records released several greatest hits packages such as Creedence Gold, More Creedence Gold, and Pre-Creedence, a compilation of early recordings. Fantasy Records also released a highly successful double album, Chronicle, the collection of Creedence's 21 hit singles. That was in 1976. That's the one that's still charting today. Several years later, the label released a live recording entitled The Royal Albert Hall Concert. Now, contrary to its title, it was recorded in Oakland, California, not at the Royal Albert Hall at all. And that was part of why Fogerty couldn't stand Saul Zaentz and Fantasy Records because of his dishonesty. Now, subsequent issues of the original 1981 album has simply been marketed as The Concert, okay? Now, the success of CCR made Fantasy and Saul Zaentz a great deal of money because he owned the rights, remember. And Fantasy built a new headquarters building in 1971 in Berkeley, California. Zaentz also used his wealth to produce a number of successful films. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Amadeus, The English Patient are 3 films that Zaentz produced with CCR money. In 2004, he sold Fantasy Records to Concord Records. Now, as a goodwill gesture, Concord honored the unfulfilled contractual promises Fantasy made nearly 40 years earlier, finally paying CCR a higher royalty rate on their sales and restoring John's ownership of his songs back to him. Now, John, seeing that Zaentz was no longer involved with the company, also signed a new contract with Concord/Fantasy Records. In 2005, the label released The Long Road Home, a collection of CCR and Fogerty solo classics. After Revival came out on the Fantasy label in October of 2007, but before his following album, The Blue Ridge Rangers Ride Again, Fogerty switched from Fantasy to his own label, Fortunate Son. Now, the original CCR lineup rarely reunited after their breakup. All 4 members are present in Tom's 1974 album, Myopia. But again, remember, they were present on the album, but John Fogerty did not record with them. John, Cook, and Clifford played together at their El Centro High School reunion in 1983, but they played as the Blue Velvets, not as CCR. In the 80s and 90s, new rounds of lawsuits between the band members as well as against the former management deepened their animosities. By the time CCR was inducted to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1993, John refused to perform with Cook and Clifford. The pair were barred from the stage while John played with an all-star band that included Bruce Springsteen and Robbie Robertson. Tom's widow, Tricia, had expected a CCR reunion and even brought the urn containing her husband's ashes for the ceremony. Furious, Cook and Clifford, who were seated with their families at a table across the room from Fogerty, walked out of the ballroom just as the performance began and would later write separate letters to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame board of directors saying it was hurtful and insulting to allow the performance to continue without them. In July 2011 interview with the Calgary Herald, John admitted that he would at least be willing to consider reuniting with Cook and Clifford. But that goes on, and basically they gave it lip service. That was really never going to happen, okay? That ship has sailed. While 3 of the 4 members are around, they're both years older than they were before, and basically they've all said, look, once upon a time it would have been nice, but this isn't going to happen. We're not going to get together, and maybe it's all for the best. John Fogerty, without a doubt, is one of the most talented rock and roll artists of all times. John was the brains behind CCR. He wrote all the songs. He produced their albums. He managed the group. The other guys showed up to practice and play. They were in essence session musicians. Now, Fogerty's probably right in the fact that he needed to take control of the band and do it his way, because the whole band concept, there's no I in team, okay? That wasn't going to work. And with that last album that didn't fly because it wasn't all Fogerty's, kind of laid credence, pardon the pun, to what Fogerty believed. Fogerty was the brains behind CCR. Now, here's the thing. John Fogerty apparently, and I would say this if he was sitting right next to me, John Fogerty appears to be the poster boy for the end justifies the means. He has made tens of millions of dollars. CCR and John Fogerty are some of they're rock and roll royalty. Everybody's heard of John Fogerty, okay? Everybody. Few people have heard of Stu Cook or Doug Clifford. They just haven't, okay? He achieved everything he wanted to achieve and alienated his lifelong friends, alienated his brother, who's now dead, and he can never go back and make that right. The end justifies the means. And I guess if there's a moral to the story, dear listeners, please consider what you do in life. And I try to do this all the time, sometimes successfully, sometimes unsuccessfully. But try to understand what you do in life defines you. And what I mean by that is how you live your life, how you get along with people, how you get along with your family, how you form a family, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Sure, the professional part of it, that's all well and good. And I'm not going to be naive enough to say, well, you really don't need money. You need a minimal amount of money. No. If you make a good living, the better living you make, the more money you make, the more enjoyable your life can become, to a point. John Fogerty is worth tens of millions of dollars, and he fought all the way. Was it worth it? Maybe. Maybe to him it was, but it'll never bring back his dead brother. It probably will not bring back his childhood friends. So you made a lot of money, but you alienated your brother and you lost your best friends. Is it worth it? I say, I don't think so. Well, that's it. We're done. JamesStrongShow@hotmail.com. That's the email address. Send me your email. I will send you a link to the podcast. You can download and listen to it at your leisure, or pick up the podcasts, as they say now, wherever you pick up your podcasts. The James Strong Show is there. That's it. We're done. Until next time, this is James Strong saying adios.